Hi, everybody. Good to connect with you again. Today is Thursday, November 5th. There's something significant about that date. Election day was November 3rd, and we still don't know the results of the election. So Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and we're a couple of days into this, and we don't know the results. It's close. We're close to finding out. But this was also predictable. We knew that because of this year, because of 2020, because of COVID, that the count was going to take a little bit longer, that the process was going to take a little bit longer. So it's not a surprise. But people are waiting at this point still to find out who will be the next president of the United States. We also know that there'll probably be some recounting because right now it's fairly close. And we also know that there may, in fact, be some lawsuits. We don't know, but we expect to hear soon. We expect to know. Hopefully by the end of the week, we'll know who the president of the United States is. So there again is an artifact of 2020. So the other thing that we have for you, Margaret O'Mara and I just had a conversation that you'll see on video. And I asked Margaret to come in the day after the election to reflect on what she saw and what she experienced during the election herself. She's a historian of presidential elections, a U.S. history historian. And so Margaret's reflecting with me about what election night was like for her, what she saw, what's unique about this election, what's new, what can we anticipate, what's not new about this election. So a question that I have for you is not necessarily related to the discussion with Margaret. It's more related to you. So 2020, we've experienced this election now. Some of you are from this country and you experienced this election directly by voting. Some of you are not from this country and you didn't vote. But what's your experience in 2020 of this election? I want you to think about that, write about that, and reflect about that. What is this election in 2020? What has it meant to you personally? So reflect on that a bit. And thank you for connecting. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Hi, everybody. Back and fortunate to have Margaret O'Mara back again. And today is November 4th. It's 2:00 in the afternoon. It is technically the day after the election. And what is happening now is not unexpected in many regards. Tell us what's going on now, Margaret, and what you've been seeing, what you've been feeling today. What's going on at the moment?
Well, now is going on something that we'd been warned about that would likely happen, particularly because there's so many mail-in votes. Washington, we do all mail-in elections. We got it down. These other states that don't normally do it, we're adopting it for the first time and had some court imposed delays in counting, among other things. So it's taking some time. We knew this. Now it's one thing to know it and it's another thing to feel it. So right now we are halfway through the day after the election, when we're kind of used in modern America to turning on the TV on election night, and you end the night at a somewhat decent hour, particularly on the West Coast, with a president-elect giving an acceptance speech. That didn't happen. We don't yet know. We had the race has not been declared. As we're speaking, it's looking good for Joe Biden. So he just officially got Wisconsin. It's looking like Michigan is about to be called for Biden. Some outlets may have called it, others have not. So I don't know if it's unilateral yet. And he is ahead in Arizona and Nevada. And so if he has that's a combo that kind of gets him where he needs to go. But we are Wednesday, the 4th. On Thursday, it won't be till tomorrow that Nevada posts any more vote totals. So that's not going to budge. And it's not going to be till Friday when Pennsylvania, which is a very electoral vote rich state, announces it kind of gets any closer to knowing. And in all of these races, of course, it's very, very, very close. So this is, we've had very close elections, popular vote elections before, but we have in American history. But we've had many instances where the popular vote has been really, really close, and the electoral college difference has been huge. And people particularly, well, not only people outside the United States, but a lot of people inside the United States are like, what is this crazy electoral college system? We didn't know much about how the electoral college worked for a while because it wasn't really relevant for over a century until the year 2000, when Al Gore won the popular vote by just a little bit and ultimately lost the electoral college vote because of the Florida going to George W. Bush, who became president. And so since then, we've all gotten a lot smarter about the Electoral College, but it still is a very strange system. It doesn't apply to any other election other than the U.S. president. And it is this artifact I'm going to confess to you, Ed, and to your students and to anyone who's watching this video, and anyone who takes my classes and maybe follows me on social media know that I have very strong feelings about the Electoral College, and I see it as an impediment to democracy and something that doesn't serve either of the two major parties well, and certainly doesn't serve us voters well, no matter what our political persuasion is. And I'll tell you why. Because right now because we've had now two instances in 2002, 2016, when the Republican candidate kind of got the luck of the Electoral College. It's understood now as like, oh, this is something that helps Republicans. And that actually is not, certainly not the case historically, and actually is sort of something that is, I think, a result of the way we run for president now because of this silly system. Mm-hmm. So the system exists because the founding fathers, the guys who wrote the Constitution, who had a lot of good ideas, but also had a lot of pretty lame ideas. And I would argue this was one of them. This was a tool to make sure that democracy wasn't quite democracy. That if electing a president, it was kind of a fail-safe. So you would have a popular vote for president, but you would have this middle layer, kind of a middle management in the supply chain of electors who were kind of the most educated, upstanding citizens of the state. They were educated, white, male property owners. Many were slave owners. They were the people who were considered to be the most well-informed voters. And so they kind of filtered the popular vote decision and made sure that if all the, ordinary voters who were operating in a pretty low information environment in 1789, 1796, 1800, would, make the right choice, and that a person who was unqualified wouldn't end up being elected president.
Was that a low information environment, or was that a lack of belief in the education of the common citizen?
Well, it was a combination of both. It was a combination of elitism and a desire to hold on to power for the people who were at the top. But it also was a function of early republic, where news traveled very slowly, where many, took weeks, if not months, to kind of get, from one part of the United States to another that would take, would be like a 2-hour car ride now. So it kind of was both a functional thing, but really mostly it was a sort of check on full democracy. And there were some of the founders, like James Madison, for example, believed that we should have a popular vote for president, that an electoral college was this artifact, kind of an aristocratic hangover that was not trusting in this principle of democracy. And it also kind of worked there's been a lot of debate over and conversation about the degree to which it was designed to protect slavery. And it can't be inextricable with the interests of those who enslaved other people. But it is something that isn't quite, it's kind of one step removed. It's related to the preservation of human enslavement in the way that the design of the Senate is, and the design of the House of Representatives is, and the way that our sort of strange compromises of representative democracy, which were designed to effectively make sure that the large states that consisted of a small white population and a large enslaved African American population, who of course were not counted as, not counted in this in the census, weren't counted in, as they certainly couldn't vote, but they counted into the head count of what your congressional representation was. It's all bound up in that. And so it's an artifact of a long gone era. I think if James Madison saw how it's working now, his head would explode. Well, a lot of things would make James Madison's head explode right now, including the conversation we're having over the devices we're using to have it. So
the race comes to play in the formation of the Electoral College, and may have seen its time. Let's step back a little bit, Margaret. And so you were watching the election last night, and so were millions of other people around the world. Put your historian hat on and tell us how you watch the election from somebody who studies and researches presidential elections, the history of presidents.
Mm-hmm.
How did you watch last night? How late did you stay up last night? And what was your take on what you saw?
Well, I stayed up far too late last night, and I knew better. I knew better going in that it was a great night for an early bedtime, because particularly on the West Coast, there would be little news to be made after a certain point in the evening, and yet we're just sucked into it. So, but thinking, historians know that whatever hot takes are being made, assessments are being made of the election, the day after the election, should be taken with a grain of salt. And so, and I would encourage everyone watching to, in the coming days and weeks, to, even if you completely agree with what someone's assessment is, there's a lot of dust that needs to be settled. I'm going to be really interested to know at the end of the day what the turnout was. One of the, funnily enough, the highest turnout election in American history was also the most contested, which was the election of 1876, which wasn't resolved until March of 1877, right before what was then Inauguration Day. If you think we have to wait a long time for inauguration now, back then you had to wait till March. So at least it's in January now. I think that we're going to look at very, very high turnout. I think the role of, COVID, mail-in balloting. Interestingly enough, I think that mail-in, I would love for this election to be a kind of turning point in the widespread adoption of mail-in voting. Again, we don't know how it's going to play out and how the various players are going to feel about it. But, we see here in Washington that it works really well. It increases turnout. It makes it easier. If you're going to school, if you're going to work, all you have to, you just put it in a Dropbox or put it in the mail. You don't even need a stamp anymore. It's a really great way. And you can sit at your in your room and go through the voter pamphlet, or look online at the endorsements of, by the newspapers that you, whose editorial boards you respect, and really be a much more informed voter, rather than just standing in a voting booth being like, oh, judge position number 7. Who's that person? That person's name is Mabel. My aunt is named Mabel. I'm going to vote for them. We've all had those moments with ballots where you're like, what is this? And what does this person do? And so I'm looking at that. It wasn't until the age of television that we knew the results on election night. And I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. A really important thing. Mm-hmm. We've had elections that have taken days, weeks, months to resolve. We had our first partisan election, 1800, took until February. 1824 took ages. 1876. In the 20th century, 1948 wasn't called on election night. 1960 wasn't. 2000 obviously wasn't. 2016 took a little while. 2004, really more often than not. And especially now when we have these razor thin margins in these swing states, it is a real, patience and taking lots of deep breaths is important. But I recognize that, even I who know all this stuff, it is very, very hard not to get swept up in this overloaded information environment and not have your emotions run really high.
You've mentioned some things that could well be artifacts of 2020. Correct me if I'm wrong. One is COVID, mm-hmm. voter turnout possibly, and the presence of Kamala Harris is how significant is the possibility of Kamala Harris being in the White House now, if all goes in the direction that it looks like it may? Mm-hmm. How historically significant is this moment?
We will have our first female vice president. First. Here we are, 2020. We will have our first female president, who's also our first African-American vice president, who's our first South Asian vice president because of her heritage. She's and also I think she is in her mid-50s. She is a kind of, I think I would claim her, since I'm a Gen Xer, I'll claim her as a Gen X president. I think anyone who was in high school in the 80s and had the hair and listened to the music that she listened to counts as Gen X. I don't know where you come in on that, Ed, But that's a generational, representation, slightly younger than Barack Obama, decently younger than Barack Obama. I think there's a life experience, and I'll be really, really interested to see. We've had a lot of vice presidents in modern memory who have been really elevated by their senior partner, the president, to have a really bold policy portfolio, to be very, very significant policy players. I could see that happening. Joe Biden did that under Barack Obama. Al Gore did that under Bill Clinton, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush. Harry Truman, who's a relatively new vice president, he had just come in with Roosevelt the last time he was reelected the year before, is thrust into the presidency of what is almost immediately becomes a nuclear superpower. The atomic bombs are dropped on Japan. Shortly within months of Harry Truman becoming president, he's closing out a world war. And so from then on out, kind of when the U.S. enters the age of being a global superpower, the vice presidency is an extraordinarily significant job. And then that's reinforced when John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963 and Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And then the following year is elected on his own merits in 1964 in a landslide election.
Now, I've asked about Kamala, but I stayed up late enough last night to hear the president step out onto the stage and gave a short talk. And he said, in his words, this was about 2:00 Pacific time in the morning. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We did win this election. This is a major fraud on our nation. We want all the voting to stop, and this is going to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure what he was talking about, and I was tired, so I wasn't quite sure. What was he intimating, and what's been the take on and the reflection on his response? Now, again, the election isn't over. Mm-hmm. We have a pretty strong response to something that he saw, and he called for the voting to essentially stop. Mm-hmm. And he's shy of saying that we've won this election. In fact, he said we've won this election. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think a number of things are really significant. Well, one thing this underscores, I'm always thinking about historical comparisons to other elections in American history, right? One way in which 2020 is different from all those that came before it is Donald Trump as the incumbent. He is a chief executive like no other, and including having an election night party in the East Room of the White House, which, by the way, is illegal. We have this thing called the Hatch Act, which puts this line between the campaign activities and presidential incumbent activities, and Trump has crossed that repeatedly this year. We've kind of gotten used to it, but it is something to note. This is not something that's
in the White House last night when he
was in the White House last night. So, and then coming on and saying something that I think to the media's credit was immediately called out by the networks, some of whom cut away from his speech to stop rebroadcasting, saying he's lying. This isn't reality. Now, did Trump think it was reality and no one else didn't? I don't think so. I think President Trump is a very intelligent man. I think what he was doing was trying to sow doubt about the election. He was trying to rile up and fire up supporters. He was trying to, and he's continuing to do that today. He's tweeted repeatedly. Almost all of his tweets have been labeled and muted by Twitter, which has a new policy, announced a new policy 3 days ago that seemed very clearly targeted at one Twitter user, which said, if anyone tries to call the election prematurely before states have officially called it, or two authoritative media outlets have also called it, we will block that tweet from being seen. And if you look at Trump's Twitter feed today, it's a lot of blocked. I have no idea what he's saying, but whatever he's saying is being taken off the platform. And that is to Twitter's credit, that they've moved very quickly to label and pull down tweets by the president and others that are trying to call the election too soon. And I think that's important. I have a healthy dose of skepticism about the ability of social media, to do this and to really be able to tame our information environment. I had a piece in the New York Times this morning that was talking about, great that they're doing making these moves for during the election and after. But the bigger problem is, these programs, these platforms are working as they're supposed to, and they're giant. Facebook last week announced third quarter earnings and said they have over 2.5 billion daily users on their various platforms, which is Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. They have a whole, family that worldwide. I mean, so if you have 2.5 billion people all going in and saying their piece, it is just an impossible task to try and moderate that content, to try and keep disinformation from spreading. Look, the vast majority of that 2.5 billion are not doing nefarious things. They're connecting with friends and they're, trying to be, it serves all sorts of functions.
This is an interesting confluence of your work on both the history of presidential elections and the growth of big tech. And here we are right at the intersection of that, the role that social media plays in the election. And who'd have thought that the president himself would be the source of that target, the source of so much engagement around social media. Yeah. And in this case, what I'm hearing you say, maybe even being blocked from actually using social media during the election to influence how voters participate.
I know. And Twitter in particular has been something that has aided the growth of established his political persona and aided his political rise. And it's been an extraordinarily important tool for governing for him and communication. He's used it. Twitter is for Trump, or social media is for Trump, what radio was for Franklin Roosevelt. It was this indispensable tool to communicate directly to his voters and to his supporters and persuade them to move for action. And I think what's dangerous right now is what he's doing is if he's, tweeting out both premature election results and now kind of information about, well, this is fraudulent, counting these additional votes. These are fraudulent votes. They're not fraudulent votes. No one's counting votes that were cast after the polls closed yesterday. That's not it. There are whole millions of votes, including that are waiting to be counted, including in states like Pennsylvania that were prohibited by court order by Republican appointed judges. So everything seems pretty saturated in politics. Courts are not free from politics, folks. They are part of that too. Saying you can't count anything before polls close on election day. So they're kind of doing this crazy catch up. So again, here in Washington State, I don't know about you, but I put my vote in the drop box last week at some point, and I checked we could go to the King County elections website. I think it was the next day, just to see if I don't know where it was. It had already been counted. It'd been picked up, counted. They had the whole sort of trail of it was mailed to you and then you filled it out and then we've got a really great, and kudos to Kim Wyman, our Secretary of State, who's was running for re-election, looks like she's going to win, a Republican. And Washington voters, I think that's a great example of here's someone, there's certain, no matter your party affiliation, there's certain offices where you've got to play it really straight, and voters will reward you for that and appreciate that. And I think that's a really healthy sign of a healthy democracy, that we have state officials of both parties here that have really, have done things, they've done their jobs, even when their job might not necessarily be in the interest of their party.
Right. So let's imagine then that things go the way the pattern seems, and Donald Trump's the 45th president, and there haven't been many incumbents who have not carried on to be the president. So this, I think there are 10 in the history of the U.S. who have not incumbents.
And only 3 in the 20th century that have not been reelected.
And so let's say that this...
4. I'm forgetting William Howard Taft, bless him.
And what does that then suggest is a call or a charge, maybe not a mandate for the next president.
Yeah.
But what does that say about where we are as a nation right now?
Well, I think it's a really great question, because what's happened is that the presidency winning re-election has been kind of come to be the mark of having a successful presidency. And that those who have not won re-election have been kind of pushed aside as, well, that was a failed effort. So Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, and even though his reputation has really been kind of rehabilitated in the years since, George H.W. Bush in 1992, the father of George W. Bush. they were one-term presidents. And so that's not that many, right? You have people like, John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated during his first term. You have Lyndon Johnson, who decided not to run for re-election in 1968 for what would have been his second full term. He had a sort of tail end of Kennedy, then his first term as himself, and then he didn't run again because the Vietnam War had become this huge political liability, and he kind of saw the writing on the wall and that he probably wasn't going to win the Democratic nomination. Richard Nixon, before he resigned, won re-election in a landslide in 1972. So we've had some less stellar presidents, or ones who aren't as fondly remembered by history, who were also reelected. So I think that creates this standard where, what I'm going to be really interested to, you see this in why Trump was so dead set on, I'm in this for 2 terms. Like, he's, people who don't win 2 terms are losers. I'm not a loser. I'm a winner. And Joe Biden has said at some points during the campaign that he would perhaps step aside after 1 term because he is older. But I'm really interested to see, once you're in, it's such an irresistible temptation, like a 2-term president and all the things you can do with 2 terms, all the possibilities. And, you don't have reelection like hanging over your head. And I wish it were different. I wish that we were, but in a way it's the horse race is something we all tune into. We love it. People like you and me who should know better stay up way too late watching it, even when there's nothing to say. Yep. The other thing I'm thinking a lot about today, Ed, is how this information saturated environment, how did it shape the 2020 election when all the dust is settled? Is the fact that for the last couple of weeks, we all have been barraged with information about poll after poll after poll after poll that showed Biden way ahead nationally, way ahead in swing states, way ahead in places that he did not win last night. And I wonder, I am speculating, I do not know this, but I wonder if there were some people out there who saw all those things. Maybe they went to a Trump rally or they saw one on TV and Trump's like, they're trying to steal the election from us. Don't let them do it. And you're like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to vote. I wasn't thinking about it, but you know what? I am. I'm not going to let those guys, I'm not going to let this happen. And so I wonder how the information with which we're barraged, and so much of it that our brains cannot process it, how is that swaying our behavior? How is it making us more angry? How is it making us less able to understand where the other folks are coming from who voted for the other guy? We're going to places like Twitter and Facebook for information. And we're, these are very beautifully curated to make us, connect with people who are like-minded and hear things we want to hear. And, you hear, the reactions I see on my social media feeds from people that I know here in Seattle and on the Twitter feed, I have a lot of other, people who live in coastal blue areas, that it is a very different than if I were going on and seeing, if I lived somewhere else, if I lived in a more conservative place, had more conservative friends, if I myself was a member of, say I was a libertarian and I have always been a libertarian. I've always voted libertarian. I really care a lot about libertarian issues. I've bought every book that, my Ayn Rand is, falling apart. I've read it so much. I would probably go on Facebook and I would get a lot of things being like, I can't believe that, the libertarians didn't do this or that, the other. So it is I'm saying all this because it becomes really, really hard for us to be able to see the other side. And this is not a kind of both sides. Everyone's got a right to have their views. I think there's so many things that President Trump has said and done, particularly things that have been discriminatory. They have been racist. They have been authoritarian. They have been really undermining the values of the shared values of so many people in this country. I think it's kind of, we get in dangerous territory when we talk about American values, because oftentimes that can be loaded. We all may be citizens of one place, but we all have had very different experiences of that citizenship. Nonetheless, I think we can, we should not normalize some of the things that we have experienced in the 4 years leading up to this moment. And we also should not normalize some of the extreme experiences that we've had just during this pandemic year. And let that kind of the incredible sort of high adrenaline, emotional, and so much sort of anger about the state of things and a feeling of powerlessness. It is difficult at times not to feel overwhelmed by that. And it's important to not let oneself be overwhelmed and remember that. And one thing, really powerful thing happened yesterday that has happened again and again and again. And yesterday, this may be the biggest number of people who voted in a presidential election in American history, period. And even at the back in the 19th century days of high turnout, most women couldn't vote. Black Southerners, most of the Black population in the United States was in the South and were disenfranchised by poll taxes, by violence, by all the things that. So it is, let us celebrate the fact that we have this franchise that so many people are allowed to enjoy, and that can change history.
So on that question, or on that issue, and this is just a feeling that I have at 2:30 this afternoon on November 4th. And there isn't anybody celebrating just yet. And in fact, no matter what side people are on, blue or red, Democrat, Republican, in the center somewhere, there's this sense of almost fatigue and even a little bit of sadness. And part of the refrain that I'm hearing is when people are looking at maps, which we've been doing for a day and a half, I'm hearing people say, it's exhausting. I'm sad because we look as divided as a nation as we've ever been. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's true, but there's a sense that I'm hearing that over and over again. Are we as divided as we've ever been? Because a lot of people voted, given what you just said about the president, a lot of people voted, cast their votes for him. And also, even those that are Biden supporters, they're not celebrating in the street right now. I know a victory hasn't been declared yet, but what's your sense of how divided we are? There's some blue and there's a whole lot of red, and there's this sense that there's not a lot in between, and there's not a lot of between us as a nation. Is there evidence to suggest that we are more divided now? And what gives you hope as someone who thinks about this historically and also thinks about implications for now?
Mm-hmm. Well, we might be a little more angry than we've been in recent memory, and that has fueled divisions. But divisions, and some pretty fierce ones and fierce disagreements, divisions that have been regional, that have been racial, that have been based on class, based on all sorts of things, are perennial feature of American government, governance, and politics. This morning, I was looking at press coverage of the 1932 election, but that was the election where Franklin Roosevelt beat Herbert Hoover, because that's what presidential historians do. We like to, maybe that's our therapy. We drink coffee and look at old news clips. And I was struck by a piece that I was in the New York Times in late October 1932 that was saying America is essentially more divided than ever. It's a divided nation. And then the category that the reporter was the categories were East and West, but she was using those as shorthand for kind of urban and rural, red state, blue state. And some of the particulars were different, and the particular issues that were driving it. One of the big issues of that moment seems funny because it was the Great Depression and that was kind of a big deal, but a huge, huge electoral issue that actually many in politics thought was going to be the decisive issue deciding the election was prohibition, the prohibition of alcohol, which had been by constitutional amendment prohibited at the end of the teens and was still in force in 1932. It was lifted in 1933. It's one of the first things the Roosevelt administration did. But that was a huge kind of social issue in the way that abortion or same-sex marriage is today. It was, do you think that it's, alcohol is the demon drink and it should not be legal, or are you cool with that? And it also was bound up with anti-immigrant politics and sort of family values politics, 1920s style. So it's good. I think that's a useful, I do those sorts of things partially because it's my job, but also partially because it really does help put it in context. We have had an incredibly polarized. What brings us together? Well, the 1932 is a great example. The political genius of Franklin Roosevelt, and he was not unilaterally, like there were plenty of people who didn't like him. But what he was able to do is he, like Ronald Reagan, a couple generations later, was incredibly good at political communication and using mass media to communicate directly to people. And I think Roosevelt in particular combined leadership, rhetorical leadership, moral leadership, inspiring people, saying it's going to be okay. This is going to be really, really hard, but we're going to get through this. And then coupling that with really transformative policy change and a really sort of reinvented role of the government that put the government to work in reviving the economy when the private sector just didn't have the capacity to do that, and creating what Roosevelt called economic security. Basically, here's a bottom through which we will not let you fall. We're not going to make you all rich. This isn't socialism. This isn't any sort of ism. This is simply capitalism with a little sort of more compassionate face, or a capitalism that's a little less precarious and unexpected. I think leadership can take a very divided nation and remarkably quickly. You can have issues that were the issues of the day. Prohibition, great example. You thought people were just going to I'm going to die on that hill. And then a few years later, no. You can take a United States that in the 1920s had the highest Ku Klux Klan membership ever. Huge, huge mainstream organization. Everyone's like, I'm all in, including in the state of Washington. And in, you had rallies in downtown Seattle. And the membership just goes off a cliff in the 1930s because people had other things, other places to pour their energy. And they had other ways to get a sense of belonging. And one way to get a sense of belonging was to be part of this grand national project of national economic rebuilding, and then the project of fighting Hitler and fighting fascism in World War II.
The election hasn't been called yet, but I want to thank you, Margaret, for spending time with us both before the election and after the election. And thank you for helping us understand that there's some things about 2020 that are really unique and historic. And there's some things about 2020 that aren't all that unique and aren't all that new. But what a special year. And so we'll be looking at your piece in the New York Times and the others that are forthcoming, and I'm sure we'll see you in the news. So thank you for helping lead us through this moment, Margaret, and thank you for joining our class and our community.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Ed.